All right, so for those of you who don't know me, my name's Dan Abbott. I'm the commander with Campbell County Militia, and this is our Newcomers brief. When we wrap this up, we'll pull everybody else in here and we'll have our regular monthly business meeting. We're going to give you a brief overview of the history of the organization, why it exists, why we believe that it is important, and why we believe that the founders emphasized necessary to the security of a free state. It is the only thing that the founders called necessary. So, history of the organization. If you go all the way back to, if you guys remember that huge protest at Lobby Day in, what was that, would have been 2020, I believe, right? So basically what happened is the legislature said, hey, we've got this massive sweeping gun control legislation that we're gonna try to push through, and a whole pile of patriots showed up at the Capitol, said, we're not interested in your gun control. I think probably a good estimate on that would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 people. I heard estimates that were a lot higher than that, but I think those are a little unrealistic. I think 50,000 is probably pretty close. And as a result of that, you had that 2A sanctuary resolution movement, which swept all across the state, which, cool idea, but they ultimately don't really mean much. But as part of that, you had sheriffs speaking out and saying, no, we're not going to participate in your gun control. You had boards of supervisors passing these resolutions. And one of the legislators, I believe he's out of Newport News, Virginia House of Delegates, made the statement to the press that, well, if these counties think that they can defy the state, they're wrong. We'll nationalize the Guard. We'll come and remove their elected officials. So ultimately, he's wrong. They don't have the authority or the ability to do that, really. But nevertheless, he made the threat. And in response to that, Bedford County had a public militia muster, because the perception there is now, wait a minute. You know, it's one thing for you state to think that you have jurisdiction over state representatives, you know, House of Delegates or senators, but our local representatives, you have no jurisdiction over local representatives. You don't have the authority to come in here and take away our elected officials at the local level. So how do you stop that? Well, there was an organization that was built to do that. It was Constitutional Militia. So in response to that, Bedford County had their first public muster, which was that right beginning of February?
February 5th,
Yeah, February 5th or something, somewhere thereabouts.
15th.
15th, okay. So they had over 600 people in attendance at a public militia muster in a public park with the sheriff in attendance. That's pretty impressive. We saw what took place in Bedford and went, these guys are definitely on the right track. We need to do that in Campbell. So about 2 weeks later, we had the same thing. We had a public militia muster here in Campbell County. And we had, I think, about 400 people show up to that, and ended up with about 250 names on a roster. So as part of that, we had muster cards, and on those muster cards, we had a box you could check interested in leadership. We had about 20 people check that box. So we called and put everybody in the little conference room at the library and looked around the table and went, what have we done? Apparently, the 20 of us are now in charge of a 250-member militia. Now what? What do we do? What does this look like? How does this work? This hasn't been done in 200 years at least. So we started talking about it and going, okay, well, some of the finest men in the history of the world, in my opinion, said that this was necessary to the security of a free state. So usually when you say that, and what the mainstream media wants you to think of is neo-Nazi, anarchist, white supremacist, BDU camouflage, face paint, ponytails, and M16s and Bowie knives. Because that was the perception, part of that earned all through the 80s and 90s, and part of that a narrative created by the left to demonize what they consider to be a threat to their power. So that's clearly not what the founders meant when they said necessary to the security of a free state. So what did they mean? All right, well, let's look at militia in the 1770s. What do those organizations look like? How did they function? What made them well regulated? So sitting around that table, we came up with 3 characteristics or 3 things that we felt made those organizations necessary. The first was taken right out of Virginia Code Section 44-1. So if you're not familiar with Virginia Code Section 44-1, it actually defines militia in the state of Virginia. It defines it as having 3 distinct components. One is the Virginia Army National Guard, one is the Virginia Defense Force, and the third is what it calls the unorganized militia, which it further defines as being the whole body of the people, males ages 16 to 55, trained to arms. Okay, that's probably an important characteristic of this. It's the whole body of the people. It's all of the able-bodied or military-aged males in the community are part of this. Okay, that's probably important. What other characteristic was true about all these organizations? Well, every community had one. There wasn't a town or a hamlet anywhere in America that didn't have an organized militia of some variety. It may have been 4 people in a very small community, but they had one. So every community had one. Why did every community have one? Because these organizations covered down on a whole bunch of other stuff besides just gunfighting, because they were the military-aged males. What happens if you wanted to build a new bridge to make your town more accessible, put it on a high-speed avenue of approach or a well-traveled road? Called out the militia, all of the able-bodied men. They would come and chip in. What about if you wanted to build a new church? All the able-bodied men. What if there was a fire? Militia, all the able-bodied men. So those organizations were necessary. The third characteristic that we identified was the quality of character of the men that led those organizations and steered those ships. Those men were Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Patrick Henry and John Adams and Sam Adams, and that list goes on and on and on. And again, I would argue these are the finest men in the history of the world, certainly the finest men in the colonies. The quality of character of those men is what steered those ships, and I believe is absolutely essential. You know, I believe that there's a finite number of leaders. I think that men are either born leaders or they're not. If they're not born a leader, they never will be. It doesn't matter what circumstances they're placed in, what school they go to, none of that matters. They're never going to be a leader. It's not in them. But those who are born leaders then become products of their environment. They're influenced by the schools that they go to. They're influenced by their parents. They're influenced by other leaders that they interact with. And that affects the way they develop. You know, some men will develop into evil leaders. Adolf Hitler is a good example. Finite number of leaders. I think that those men are already identified in our communities. We're not going to go way down into the backwoods somewhere down by Brook Neal or something and find the next Patrick Henry like living in a shack. It's not going to happen. Patrick Henry is the same thing that he was, or is the same thing today that he was then. Patrick Henry was a lawyer. I think those men are already identified in our communities. They sit right up here. They're board of supervisors. They're county sheriffs. They're businessmen. They're merchants. They're pastors of churches. They're mayors of town. They're U.S. congressional representatives. These men are already identified in our communities. It's just educating them. Honestly, that's the biggest obstacle to us, is that we're facing 100 years of indoctrination in what we call public schools, which are really government indoctrination centers. So we don't understand what we have been given, what we've been entrusted with. You can't pull people on the street and ask them what form of government we have in America. They won't be able to tell you. Almost without exception, they're going to say it's a democracy. I'm sorry, it's not. I was watching Fox News the other day in a restaurant. Huge banner, defending democracy. Really? Really? Benjamin Franklin said it's a republic if you can keep it. Maybe we should be about the work of trying to keep it. So, that was kind of where we were at. We decided to adopt a military format. It is ultimately a military organization, not paramilitary, military organization. So we adopted a military rank structure. We fooled around a little bit with a kind of a rule by committee, which was not super effective, and so ultimately we adopted a military rank structure. Campbell County Board of Supervisors, you see up there March 3rd, 2020. This board actually passed a resolution that formally recognized Campbell County Militia as a county asset, which is huge. To have a board that has the understanding of the importance and the trust in their people to back standing an organization like this up and formally recognize them is huge. There are only 2 counties in the entire nation that have formally recognized by local government county militias, and it's Campbell County and Bedford County. Bedford passed their resolution a ways later, but nevertheless they did. All right, so mission statement. To be a force ready and necessary for the security of a free state and to assist citizens of Campbell County with any crisis that may occur. So that's kind of like your umbrella statement that allows us to cover down on all of those other things that I talked about that the militia was responsible for in the 1770s. Like, yeah, okay, we have volunteer ambulance corps, and we have volunteer fire departments, we have sheriff departments, and they cover down on some of those aspects. But there's huge gaping holes in that. We see that all the time. In fact, I have a thank you letter from Mike Miller, as the sheriff in Bedford County, because we took about 20 personnel and a whole bunch of heavy equipment to help out Bedford County when they had the tornado blow through. And Mike was very, very grateful because, that's not really something that we have. Sure, we had first responders show up and search collapsed structures for survivors, but then what? There's a whole lot more work that needs to be done. And so these organizations are very important. They cover down a whole bunch of other stuff. We are partnered with La Villa Restaurant on Timberlake. Mike runs a food bank in partnership with us. We have people that put in an enormous amount of man hours helping with that. We have cleared roads all over the county from storms of every variety for ambulances to get through and whatever. What else have we done community service-wise? We've dabbled. Yeah. Yep. We did a bunch of work to support Cleaning for the World during COVID because being a county asset, just like the fire department and the sheriff's department, we're not restricted by COVID. We're essential. So we were able to help out Cleaning for the World. That was actually at the request of Whit Clark, the sheriff. He said, gee, I don't really have the manpower to help with this, but I know an organization that will help. And so he put us in touch with Cleaning for the World, and we put in, I don't even know how many man hours with them. It was a pile. But yeah, we've partnered with all different organizations in the community and helped out with everything you can imagine because, this is what we do. We're Americans. We're about being good citizens. So vision is to be an organization that sets the standards for other constitutional militias and be ready to assist all Campbell County first responders. So yes, of course, within our community, we partner with the fire department, the ambulance corps, and the sheriff's department and help them out with the Department of Social Services and everything else you can imagine, help them out anywhere that they need it. But because we recognize the importance of this organization, and let me share an example. So we talked earlier about that 2A sanctuary resolution movement that swept all across the state, and we're good. Those took off like wildfire. And for perspective, there's 133 counties or city municipalities in the state of Virginia, and 104 of them passed 2A sanctuary resolutions. That's a monstrous majority. Fairly impressive, quite honestly. But again, those resolutions really mean nothing. It's like a hear ye. Doesn't have teeth per se. But what do those resolutions do? They tell us where the counties stand. 104 of them are at least willing to verbally defy Richmond. Well, what if 104 counties each had a 100-member constitutional militia? I think 100 is a really low estimate. I've got almost 500 on my roster in Campbell County. Bedford's 300 and something. I think 100 is a very low estimate. But just for the sake of round math, let's use 100. Times 104 counties, that's 10,400 men at arms. That seems like quite a bit. What if we factored in the sheriff's departments? I think we should. I think in most places the sheriffs are red, white, and blue-blooded. They believe in America. And I think if they had real support, sheriffs, not state police, I think that they would back the people. So let's say there's 50 deputies per county. Now we're talking about 15,000 men at arms, the rural part of the state. Well, for perspective, I work for the Virginia Army National Guard. End strength for the Virginia Army National Guard is about 7,000. Now all of a sudden, that monopoly on force that government maintains doesn't really exist. Can they make a threat against a 15,000 man unit? No, they can't. And that's if we assumed that every single member of the Virginia Army National Guard were bootlicking communists and would carry out any order that was issued to them, which they're not. I promise. There's at least one. Same thing with the Virginia State Police. They're way under strength. Their end strength is supposed to be 1,800, and they're shy of 1,100, so they're way under strength. But ultimately, like, what is government? I would argue, as Wes's definition, actually, he's the executive officer for the organization. Wes says that government is whoever has a monopoly on force. I think that's a pretty good definition. Ultimately, government maintains a monopoly on force, and they back everything that they do with a threat of violence. I would argue that there's really only two powers or two forces on earth, excluding the power of God. One of them is violence. Everybody knows that. You see it acted out all over the world. We saw it acted out on our city streets a year and a half ago or whatever that was. Violence is a real force. Well, what's the other one? I would argue it's threat of violence. It's the Teddy Roosevelt principle of walk softly, carry a big stick. What does government possess? They possess a threat of force, threat of violence, right? And ultimately, they back everything they do with it. You say, no, they don't back everything that they do. Okay. So we have a Federal Communications Commission. They regulate what I can say on the radio, right? Currently, you're not allowed to say naughty four-letter words. Most everybody's like, yeah, those are bad words. We shouldn't say those words. Okay. Well, what if tomorrow that four-letter word is MAGA, or militia, or republic, or constitution, or liberty? If I say a naughty word on the airwaves, what does the FCC do? They levy a fine, tell me I'm a bad boy, probably put me in timeout. And what if I say, no, this is America. I have a First Amendment right to speak how I choose, say what I want. You can't take that away from me. I'm not paying your fine. All right, they're going to levy a bigger fine, probably ban me from the radio, whatever. If I say, no, I'm not paying it. It's my First Amendment right. Well, then what? Well, then they're going to issue me a court order to appear or a summons or whatever. If I still refuse, then what? They're going to issue a warrant for my arrest. If I still refuse, then what? They will arrest me. And they will use force of violence to do it. Ultimately, second, third order effects. Government will back everything that they do with a threat of violence. Government is not supposed to have a monopoly. In America, government is not supposed to have a monopoly on force. That's not the way this was designed. I ask politicians, everyone that I interact with, which is a lot, I ask them, what's the purpose of government? It's a little bit of a trick question because government is really, really broad. What kind of government are we talking about? Is it a monarchy? Is it a dictatorship? Is it an oligarchy? Is it a democracy? Or is it a constitutional republic? So it's a little bit of a trick question. First, I would like them to realize that this is a constitutional republic. Going forward from there, what's the purpose of government in America? Does anybody know? Well, first off, we all think it's a democracy, so let's define what the purpose of a democracy is. I would say the purpose of a democracy is to protect the individual liberty of the majority, 51%. Their liberty will be protected because they vote that way. Okay? Well, how is a republic different from that? How is a constitutional republic separated from a democracy? Well, the purpose of government in a constitutional republic is that we protect the individual liberty of the minority, even if that's one person out of 360 million. Government is there to say, no, that's his individual liberty. You don't have the authority or the right to take it. If we want to know exactly what the purpose of government in America is, I think we have a document that tells us exactly what the purpose of government in America is. It's the Declaration of Independence. Let's look at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. When a government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government. Okay, so the purpose of government is to protect life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, individual liberty. That's why government in America exists. But politicians don't know that. People don't know that because we're fighting 100 years of indoctrination. We can't even tell you what form of government we have, let alone how it's supposed to work. Yeah, what we stand for, being a true constitutional militia, and what we mean by that is looking at the organizations that existed in the 1770s that were called necessary to the security of a free state as opposed to what the modern perception of them is. Serving all the citizens in Campbell County, and that's kind of, that next point is kind of like our motto, our slogan is neighbors helping neighbors, because like ultimately that's the thrust of it. That's the whole idea, is that we can protect and help our communities. Educating the community for preparedness and self-defense. We've got our hand in a thousand different things when it comes to that, as far as all kinds of homesteading and prepping classes and wilderness survival and all that kind of stuff, trying to help educate people and educate them to understand what form of government we have and how it's supposed to work. Yep, what we're against: hate and intolerance, discrimination of any kind, paramilitary activities. You can look up that code section if you really want to. We're not a paramilitary organization. We're a military organization. We're constitutionally protected. I'm sorry, government, if you don't like it, too bad. Obviously, these organizations have a rap for being neo-Nazi, white supremacist, whatever. I won't put up with that at all. If that's what you show up here with, there's the door. You can leave. I brought men home in a box draped in a flag. No one asked what color their skin was. I'm not interested in the racist crap. Sorry. For those of you who have a military background, we're basically a company-sized element, and a company can't function independently. They have to have battalion S shops to help facilitate their operation. So we took a company-sized element and we attached battalion-level S shops to a company. So essentially that's what you see up there. We have a company commander and an executive officer, and we have a company first sergeant, but we then have S shops that are attached to that to help facilitate the function of the organization.